The concrete walls of Fort Hackenberg held secrets that no architect had designed into them. In the winter of 1939, when snow covered the hills of Lorraine and the world held its breath before the storm, French soldiers stationed along the Maginot Line began reporting something that military command could not explain. Voices echoed through empty corridors where no one stood. Whispers curled around corners in tunnels that stretched for kilometers beneath the frozen earth. The phenomenon started small, dismissed as nerves or the tricks that isolation plays on young men far from home. But by January, the reports had multiplied beyond coincidence. Corporal Henri Dufour was the first to file an official complaint. He had been stationed at the fort for 3 months, part of a rotating garrison that manned the underground complex built to withstand any German assault. The Maginot Line represented France's answer to the trenches of the Great War, a chain of fortifications that promised never again would French soil taste invasion. Fort Hackenberg was among the largest of these installations, a subterranean city capable of housing over 1,000 men. Its galleries ran deep into the limestone, connecting ammunition stores, barracks, kitchens, and artillery casings through a network of tunnels that seemed to stretch forever in the dim electric light. Dufour had been making his rounds through Gallery 12 when he heard it. The time was just past 2 in the morning, and he walked alone as regulations required for certain security patrols. Gallery 12 ran for nearly 800 meters, linking the eastern casements to the central power station. The walls sweated condensation despite the cold outside, and his boots echoed against the concrete floor with each step. He carried a flashlight, though the overhead bulbs provided adequate illumination. Standard procedure demanded readiness for power failures. The voice came from behind him. A woman's voice, speaking in French but with an accent he could not place. She said something about water, about needing to find water before the sun rose. Dufour spun around, his hand going to his sidearm. The tunnels stretched empty behind him, the bulbs creating pools of light that faded into shadow. He called out, demanding identification. No response came. He walked back the way he had come, checking every alcove and doorway. Gallery 12 had few side passages, and he knew them all. Nothing. Nobody. He completed his patrol and reported the incident to Sergeant Beaumont, the night watch commander. Beaumont listened with the patience of a man who had heard stranger things during his 20 years of service. He made a note in the log and told Dufour to get some rest. Fatigue caused hallucinations, especially in the underground environment where natural light never penetrated and the air recycled through mechanical systems that hummed constantly in the background. Dufour accepted this explanation and said nothing more about it. But 3 nights later, Private Laurent Mercier heard the same voice in Gallery 9. Then Corporal Thomas Girard reported whispers in the ammunition depot on Level 3. By the end of January, 12 soldiers had filed reports describing similar experiences. The voice always spoke French. It always mentioned water or thirst. And it always occurred between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, when the fort operated with minimal staff and the corridors lay mostly empty. Captain Jean-Baptiste Arnoux commanded Fort Hackenberg's garrison. He was 42 years old, a veteran of the final year of the Great War, who had spent his career preparing for the next conflict everyone knew was coming. The reports troubled him not because he believed in ghosts, but because unexplained phenomena affected morale. Soldiers needed to trust their environment, especially men who lived like moles beneath tons of rock and concrete. He ordered a thorough inspection of the ventilation system, thinking perhaps air currents carried sounds from other sections of the fort in unexpected ways. The engineers found nothing unusual. The fort's design incorporated lessons learned from decades of military architecture. The French had studied fortifications from Vauban to Verdun, creating a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Fort Hackenberg sprawled across 19 combat blocks connected by underground passages that allowed men and supplies to move without exposure to enemy fire. The deepest galleries reached 30 meters below the surface. Over 10 kilometers of tunnels laced through the complex, some wide enough for electric trains that transported ammunition from the magazines to the gun turrets. The garrison lived entirely underground during wartime protocols, emerging only for specific duties at the surface blocks. This isolation created its own psychological pressures. The air smelled of machine oil and damp concrete. The temperature remained constant, neither warm nor truly cold, a perpetual chill that seeped into bones over time. Men slept in barracks carved from rock, ate in mess halls lit by artificial light, and worked shifts that bore no relation to the sun's position in the sky above. Some adapted easily. Others struggled with the sensory deprivation, the absence of weather and seasons, and the simple sight of stars. Captain Arnoux considered these factors when evaluating the voice reports. Mass suggestion could spread through a confined population. One man's hallucination might become another's expectation, especially if the first account got embellished in retelling. But the consistency of the details bothered him. The same female voice, the same concern about water, the same time window. He began interviewing the witnesses personally, looking for patterns that might reveal a mundane explanation. Corporal Dufour sat across from him in the captain's office, a small room off the main command center. Arnoux asked him to describe exactly what he had heard. Dufour closed his eyes, remembering. The voice had sounded close, as if the speaker stood just behind his left shoulder. She spoke clearly despite the tunnel's acoustics, which normally made distant sounds echo and blend together. She had said, "Where is the water? I must find water before dawn." The phrasing struck Dufour as odd when he reflected on it later. Not, "I need water," but "I must find water," as if searching for a specific source rather than requesting a drink. Private Mercier described an almost identical experience. The voice came from behind him while he walked through Gallery 9 during a maintenance inspection. Female, French, the same question about water. He had turned and found nothing, no footsteps, no breathing, no presence of any kind. Just his own pulse hammering in his ears and the eternal hum of the ventilation fans. The pattern held across all 12 reports. Arnoux made notes and consulted with the fort's medical officer, Dr. Émile Roussel. The doctor suggested carbon monoxide testing, though the ventilation system included multiple safeguards against such contamination. Perhaps a localized leak affected certain areas at specific times. The hypothesis seemed weak, but they tested anyway. The results came back negative. Air quality throughout the fort remained well within acceptable parameters. Meanwhile, the whispers continued. Corporal Victor Blanc heard them in Gallery 15. Private André Fontaine encountered the voice near the motor room on level 2. Sergeant Paul Mercier, Laurent's older brother, reported a similar incident in the connecting tunnel between blocks 7 and 8. The garrison began talking among themselves, theories spreading through the barracks like smoke. Some men claimed the fort was haunted by a woman who had died during construction. Others suggested German psychological warfare, though no one could explain how the enemy might infiltrate sounds into the sealed complex. A few religious soldiers spoke of demonic manifestation, punishment for France's secular government and its treatment of the church. Captain Arnoux dismissed supernatural explanations, but found himself running out of rational alternatives. He contacted regional command and requested permission to bring in outside investigators. The request was denied. France stood on the brink of war. German forces massed along the border. The Maginot Line represented the nation's primary defense, and any suggestion that its fortifications suffered from problems, even unexplained acoustic phenomena, could undermine public confidence. The voices were to be handled internally and quietly. So Arnoux took a different approach. He began spending nights in the tunnels himself, walking the galleries where soldiers had reported encounters. He wanted to hear the voice firsthand, to evaluate it with his own senses rather than relying on second-hand accounts. For 5 nights, he patrolled various sections of the fort during the critical hours between midnight and dawn. He heard nothing unusual, just the ordinary sounds of the underground complex. Machinery humming, water dripping, his own footsteps echoing off concrete walls. On the 6th night, February 14th, he walked through Gallery 12, the same corridor where Corporal Dufour had first heard the voice. Arnoux chose it deliberately, thinking perhaps the location held significance. He carried his service pistol and a flashlight, though, like Dufour, he found the overhead lighting adequate. The time was 2:47 in the morning. He had been walking for nearly 3 hours, and fatigue was beginning to assert itself. He considered ending the patrol and returning to his quarters. Then he heard her. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves rather than any specific direction. Female, speaking French with an accent that might have been Alsatian or perhaps German, he could not quite distinguish. She said, "The water is poisoned. Where can I find clean water?" The words hung in the air for a moment, then faded. Arnoux stood frozen, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. He swept his flashlight across the tunnel, illuminating every shadow. Empty. Completely empty. He called out, "Identify yourself immediately." His voice echoed back at him, but no other response came. He checked his watch, noting the exact time. 2:48. He walked the length of Gallery 12, examining every possible hiding place. The tunnel had few alcoves, and those it possessed were clearly visible and unoccupied. No one could have spoken and then vanished in the seconds it took him to react. Arnoux stood in the center of the gallery, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The temperature had not changed. The lighting remained steady. Nothing seemed different from any other moment in any other tunnel. Yet he had heard the voice as clearly as he heard his own thoughts. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything he could remember. The exact words, the tonal quality, the strange phrasing about poisoned water. When he returned to his office, he found Dr. Roussel waiting for him. The medical officer looked troubled. He had been reviewing historical records related to Fort Hackenberg's construction, which had taken place between 1930 and 1935. The official documents showed nothing unusual, but Roussel had spoken with some of the older soldiers who had been stationed at the fort during its final building phases. They remembered stories, rumors really, about a civilian worker who had died during the excavation of the lower galleries. The details were fragmentary and possibly unreliable, filtered through years of retelling. But according to these accounts, a woman had been employed as a cook for the construction crews. Her name appeared in no official records that Roussel could find, suggesting she might have been hired unofficially or through a subcontractor who failed to maintain proper documentation. Sometime in 1934, she had allegedly become ill while working underground. The symptoms suggested poisoning, possibly from contaminated water. She supposedly died in one of the tunnels before anyone could bring her to the surface. Arnoux listened to this story with skepticism. Legends grew around any major construction project, especially one as massive and secretive as the Maginot Line. Workers died during the building of Fort Hackenberg. That was documented fact. The official count listed 17 fatalities over 5 years, mostly from accidents involving heavy machinery or explosives. But the records named every victim, and none were female. The fort employed some women in administrative and support roles, but they worked at surface facilities, not in the dangerous environment of the active construction zones. Still, the parallels between the legend and the reported voices were striking. A woman seeking water, mention of poison, the underground setting. Either the current witnesses had heard the old story and unconsciously incorporated it into their hallucinations, or something deeper connected the past to the present. Captain Arnoux decided to expand his investigation. He assigned teams to search through the fort's archives for any reference to female employees during the construction period. He contacted retired officers who had overseen the building project, and he continued his nocturnal patrols, hoping to encounter the voice again under controlled conditions. The archive search yielded limited results. Most construction records focused on technical specifications and material inventories. Personnel files for civilian workers were sparse and poorly organized, but Private Fontaine, who had been assigned to help with the research, found something interesting in a box of miscellaneous documents from 1934. A handwritten invoice from a local food supplier listed payment to someone named Margaret Keller for cooking services during August of that year. The invoice specified she worked at the underground site, which almost certainly referred to Fort Hackenberg. The name was German, not uncommon in Lorraine given the region's complicated history of shifting between French and German control. But official records showed no Margaret Keller employed at the fort in any capacity. If she had worked there, it was off the books. And if she had died there, her death had gone unrecorded in any official document. Arnoux stood in the archive room, holding the faded invoice in his hands. The paper felt fragile, ready to crumble. A single piece of evidence that someone named Margaret Keller had existed and had worked in these tunnels. It proved nothing about the voices. It certainly did not confirm that her ghost haunted Gallery 12 or any other section of the fort. But it provided a thread, however thin, connecting past to present. February gave way to March. The voices continued, now reported almost nightly. More soldiers heard them, always the same female voice asking about water. The garrison's morale began to suffer. Men requested transfers. Some reported difficulty sleeping, claiming they heard whispers even in the barracks when trying to rest. Captain Arnoux filed increasingly urgent reports with regional command, requesting either outside assistance or permission to evacuate certain sections of the fort for thorough investigation. His requests were denied. War was coming. France needed the Maginot Line at full operational capacity. The spring thaw brought mud to the surface and deeper cold to the tunnels. March of 1939 saw increased military activity along the entire Maginot Line as German intentions became clearer with each passing week. Fort Hackenberg increased its garrison strength to nearly 900 men, cramming additional personnel into barracks designed for smaller numbers. The overcrowding amplified every problem, including the whispers that now seemed to follow soldiers through multiple sections of the underground complex. Lieutenant Jacques Moreau arrived at the fort on March 7th as part of the expanded deployment. He was 28 years old, educated at Saint-Cyr Military Academy, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never faced anything he could not solve through logic and discipline. Captain Arnoux assigned him to oversee security protocols for the lower galleries, which meant Moreau spent most of his duty hours walking the deepest tunnels where the voice reports originated most frequently. Moreau did not believe in ghosts. He believed in German espionage, in acoustic weapons that might disorient defenders, in psychological operations designed to weaken French resolve before the first shot was fired. He read through all the incident reports with a skeptical eye, looking for patterns that might reveal enemy action. The consistency of the accounts troubled him, but consistency could be manufactured. If German intelligence had infiltrated the fort, they might be using hidden speakers or some other device to project sounds into the tunnels at calculated times. He spent his first week conducting what he called a technical audit. He examined the ventilation shafts for hidden equipment. He inspected electrical conduits for unauthorized installations. He interviewed soldiers about their exact locations when they heard the voice, mapping each incident on architectural plans of the fort. The map showed clustering in certain galleries, particularly 12, 9, and 15. These corridors shared characteristics. They ran deep, they connected older sections of the fort to newer additions, and they all passed near the original excavation zones from the early construction phase. Dr. Roussel shared his findings about Margaret Keller with Lieutenant Moreau. The younger officer examined the invoice and asked pointed questions about the search methodology. Had they checked regional death records? Had they contacted local churches that might have burial information? Had they interviewed any surviving construction workers who might remember this woman? Roussel admitted they had done none of these things, limited by time and by explicit orders not to spread rumors beyond the fort's walls. Moreau decided to conduct his own research during his next scheduled leave. On March 15th, he traveled to the town of Weckring, the nearest settlement to Fort Hackenberg. The town had provided much of the labor force during the fort's construction and would remember a death in the tunnels if one had occurred. He visited the mairie and requested access to civil records from 1934. The clerk, an elderly man named Didier Petit, remembered the construction years well. Thousands of workers had passed through Veckring, many staying in temporary housing that sprang up to accommodate the influx. The death registers for 1934 listed 43 names. Moreau went through them one by one. No Margaret Keller appeared. He expanded his search to surrounding towns. Nothing. He visited the Catholic Church and spoke with Father Christophe Blanc, who had served the parish since 1928. The priest kept meticulous records of baptisms, marriages, and funerals. He showed Moreau the ledger from 1934. Again, no Margaret Keller. But Father Blanc remembered something else. In August of that year, a woman had been brought to the church by construction workers. She was ill, possibly dying, and they wanted last rites administered. The priest had gone with them, but not to the church. They took him to a small house on the outskirts of town where several workers lodged. The woman was German-speaking, delirious with fever. She kept asking for water, saying the water was bad, that it had made her sick. Father Blanc performed the last rites and left. He never learned what happened to her after that night. He assumed she had died and been buried elsewhere, perhaps transported back to Germany if she had family there. Moreau pressed for more details. What did she look like? The priest closed his eyes, reaching back 11 years. Thin, he remembered, very thin, as if she had been ill for some time before the acute crisis. Dark hair going grey, perhaps 40 years old, though sickness made age difficult to judge. She wore working clothes, stained with what might have been kitchen grease or cooking smoke. She spoke German but seemed to understand French when the workers addressed her. The lieutenant asked if Father Blanc remembered any names. The priest shook his head. The workers had been casual laborers, probably not local men. The construction project drew people from all over France and beyond, anyone seeking employment during the difficult economic years. They came, they worked, they moved on. Many left no trace in official records. Moreau returned to Fort Hackenberg with more questions than answers. A sick woman who asked for water and spoke of poisoning. A woman who might have died but left no death certificate, no burial record, no official acknowledgement of her existence beyond a single invoice and a priest's fragmentary memory. If this was the same Margaret Keller, what had happened to her body? Where had she been buried? And why would her presence, real or imagined, manifest in the fort's tunnels 11 years after her death? He presented his findings to Captain Arnoux. The captain listened without interruption, then sat silent for several minutes before responding. The investigation was becoming more complicated rather than less, drawing them away from practical military concerns into historical mysteries that served no strategic purpose. Yet the voices continued, and now men were refusing to walk certain galleries alone. Operational efficiency was suffering. Something had to be done. Arnoux made a decision. He would organize a formal search of the oldest tunnels, particularly the sections excavated first during construction. If a body had been left behind, if someone had died in the depths and been hastily concealed rather than properly reported, they would find the evidence. And if they found nothing, then at least the search itself might reassure the garrison that their officers took the situation seriously. The search began on March 20th. Teams of soldiers equipped with portable lights and breathing apparatus entered the deepest galleries, many of which were now used only for storage or had been sealed off entirely after serving their purpose during construction. Gallery 23, one of the original exploratory tunnels, had been closed since 1935. The engineers unsealed it, and Lieutenant Moreau led a team inside. The air smelled stale, untouched by the ventilation system. Water had seeped through cracks in the concrete, forming pools on the uneven floor. The tunnel extended roughly 200 meters before ending in a blank wall where excavation had stopped. The team's lights revealed graffiti left by construction workers, names, dates, crude drawings. Evidence of human presence, but nothing suggesting tragedy. They searched methodically, checking every alcove and examining the walls for signs of disturbance. Private Fontaine noticed something odd about the floor near the tunnel's end. The concrete appeared different there, newer perhaps, or poured separately from the surrounding surface. He called Lieutenant Moreau over. The officer knelt and examined the area. The concrete was definitely distinct, a patch roughly 2 meters by 1 meter that did not match the texture or color of the rest of the floor. Moreau ordered it broken up. 2 soldiers brought tools and began chipping away at the concrete. It proved thinner than expected, only a few centimeters deep. Beneath it lay dirt, loose and dry. They dug carefully, unsure what they might find. At a depth of perhaps half a meter, a shovel struck something that was not rock. Fabric. Rotted and nearly disintegrated, but recognizably fabric. They cleared the dirt away with their hands now, moving slowly. Bones emerged from the soil, a human skeleton, partially collapsed but still roughly anatomical. Female, based on the pelvic structure. Adult, based on bone development and tooth wear. The skull showed no obvious trauma. Near the remains lay a few scattered objects, buttons from clothing, a small metal cross on a broken chain, and something that might have been a wooden spoon, though decay had reduced it to fragments. The team stood in silence, their lights casting harsh shadows across the grave. Someone had buried this woman in the tunnel floor and then covered the site with fresh concrete, hiding all evidence. No marker, no record, just a body left in the dark for years while the fort grew around it. Lieutenant Moreau ordered the tunnel sealed again and reported to Captain Arnoux. The captain contacted regional command immediately. This was no longer about unexplained voices. They had found human remains in an unauthorized burial, possibly evidence of a crime. Military police would need to be involved. The implications were serious. But regional command responded with unexpected orders. The remains were to be removed discreetly and buried properly in a military cemetery with no publicity. The investigation into how the body came to be in the tunnel was to be dropped. France could not afford scandal at the Maginot Line when war might begin at any moment. The matter was to be handled quietly and quickly. Captain Arnoux protested. A woman had died, possibly been murdered, and her death concealed. Justice demanded investigation. The reply was blunt. Justice would wait until after France had secured its borders, remove the body, seal the tunnel, and file no further reports on the subject. The captain found himself trapped between duty and conscience. He delayed implementing the orders for 3 days while he considered his options. During those 3 days, the voices in the tunnels ceased completely. Not a single soldier reported hearing the whispers that had plagued the fort for months. The galleries lay silent except for their normal mechanical sounds. On March 25th, a military chaplain arrived at Fort Hackenberg with orders to oversee the removal and reburial of the remains. Father Michel Arnaud was 56 years old, a veteran of the Great War who had served as a stretcher-bearer before taking orders. He approached the task with solemnity and efficiency. The bones were carefully collected and placed in a simple wooden casket. The few artifacts found with them were included. Father Arnaud conducted a brief ceremony in Gallery 23, speaking prayers for the dead in the empty tunnel. Lieutenant Moreau attended, as did Captain Arnoux and Dr. Roussel. A detail of 6 soldiers stood at attention. Father Arnaud read from the liturgy, his voice echoing off concrete walls. He spoke of rest eternal and light perpetual, of souls finding peace after long wandering. He did not mention the circumstances of the burial or the mystery surrounding the woman's identity. When he finished, the soldiers carried the casket out of the tunnel and transported it to a military cemetery 15 kilometers from the fort. The grave was dug in an isolated corner, far from the neat rows of marked headstones. No name was inscribed on the simple wooden cross that marked the spot. Father Arnaud said final prayers and blessed the ground. The soldiers filled in the grave. The entire procedure took less than 2 hours. That night, Corporal Dufour walked through Gallery 12 on routine patrol. The time was just past 2 in the morning, almost exactly the same moment when he had first heard the voice 3 months earlier. He walked alone, as regulations required, his footsteps echoing in the familiar rhythm. The gallery stretched before him, empty and silent. He heard nothing unusual. No voice asking about water, no whispers from empty air. just the hum of ventilation fans and the distant throb of generators. He completed his patrol and reported nothing remarkable in the log. The silence held. Days passed, then weeks, and no soldier reported hearing unexplained voices in any tunnel. The phenomenon that had troubled Fort Hackenberg for months seemed to have ended precisely when the remains were found and properly buried. Captain Arnoux noted this in his private journal, but filed no official report. Regional Command had made its position clear. Lieutenant Moreau could not let the matter rest so easily. He continued his research during off-duty hours, trying to confirm the identity of the woman they had found. He corresponded with German officials, asking about missing persons from the mid-1930s, specifically a woman named Margaret Keller who might have worked in France. The responses were unhelpful. Germany was preparing for war and had no interest in tracking down decade-old disappearances of its citizens abroad. He found one additional piece of evidence in late April. A local newspaper from August 1934 contained a brief notice about a worker dying from food poisoning at a construction site. No name was given. The article said authorities had investigated and found no fault with the food suppliers. The death was attributed to natural illness, unrelated to working conditions. The notice was buried on page 7, easy to miss unless someone was specifically searching. Food poisoning. The voice had spoken of poisoned water. Moreau wondered if the illness had been misdiagnosed or deliberately misrepresented. If a woman had died from contaminated water at a major military construction site, it would reflect poorly on the project management. Easier to call it natural causes and move on. Easier still to bury the body quietly and forget the entire incident. But someone had remembered. Or perhaps something had refused to be forgotten. For 3 months, soldiers had heard a voice asking about water in tunnels where no living person stood. The voice had fallen silent only after the hidden grave was discovered and the remains were buried with proper rites. Coincidence, Lieutenant Moreau told himself. The timing was coincidence. Yet he did not fully believe it. Dr. Roussel offered a different perspective. He had been reading about collective psychology, about how groups of people in stressful environments could share hallucinations. The isolation of fort duty, the constant tension of waiting for war, the knowledge that German forces massed just beyond the border, all of this created psychological pressure. The first voice report might have been genuine hallucination or misperception. Subsequent reports could have been suggestion, each witness primed by hearing about the previous encounters. The phenomenon fed on itself until it became self-sustaining. The discovery of the body broke the cycle. It provided closure, a rational explanation that the garrison could accept. The voices stopped, not because a ghost found peace, but because the soldiers' collective anxiety found release. The mystery was solved, or solved enough. The psychological pressure eased. Moreau listened to this explanation and acknowledged its logic. But he also remembered standing in Gallery 23, watching dirt fall away from bones that had lain hidden for years. He remembered the small metal cross found with the remains, tarnished but intact. Someone had buried that woman with a token of faith, suggesting the act was not simply concealment, but carried some element of ritual or respect. Who had buried her? That question remained unanswered. Presumably someone who worked at the fort during construction, someone who knew the tunnel system well enough to find a location where a grave would go undiscovered. Perhaps the workers who brought Father Blanc to administer last rites had returned to find her dead and made the decision to bury her secretly rather than report it to authorities. Perhaps they feared being blamed for her death or losing their employment. Economic desperation made people act in ways they might not otherwise consider. Or perhaps something darker had occurred. Perhaps her death was not entirely natural. Perhaps someone had reason to conceal it. Without investigation, the truth would never be known. Regional Command had closed that door firmly. May arrived, and with it came increased preparations for war. Fort Hackenberg received additional ammunition shipments and reinforcements. The garrison swelled to over 1,000 men. The tunnels hummed with activity as crews tested weapon systems and verified that every defensive position was ready. The voices were forgotten in the press of more immediate concerns. Captain Arnoux found himself thinking about Margaret Keller less frequently, though she still appeared in his thoughts during quiet moments. He had served in the Great War, had seen men die in ways both heroic and meaningless. He understood that individual deaths often went unmarked, that history remembered formations and battles, but rarely named every casualty. Still, there was something particularly tragic about dying anonymously in a tunnel, being buried without ceremony, and lying forgotten until chance revealed your grave. He visited the cemetery once in early May, finding the isolated corner where the wooden cross stood. Flowers grew wild there, small yellow blooms that nodded in the breeze. He stood for several minutes, thinking about the woman who lay beneath. She had come to work at a great military project, had fallen ill, had died far from whatever home she once knew. And then, she had been erased from records, hidden away, made to vanish as if she had never existed. Except she had existed. She had lived and worked and breathed the same air that now filled his lungs. She had walked tunnels that soldiers now patrolled. And somehow, in a way that defied rational explanation, she had made her presence known after years of silence. Whether the voices were real or imagined, they had served a purpose. They had led to the discovery of her grave. They had forced acknowledgement of her existence, however briefly. Captain Arnoux saluted the wooden cross and returned to his duties. War was coming. Germany would invade, and the Maginot Line would face its ultimate test. Whatever mysteries the tunnels held would have to wait. The summer of 1939 brought heat that penetrated even the deep galleries of Fort Hackenberg. The concrete walls sweated moisture constantly, and the ventilation system struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures despite running at maximum capacity. Soldiers moved through their duties in the oppressive atmosphere, aware that Europe teetered on the edge of catastrophe. German demands on Poland grew more strident with each passing week. France mobilized reserves and reinforced its border defenses. The Maginot Line became the focus of national security planning, the shield behind which the nation would stand when war finally came. Lieutenant Moreau received a transfer in June. He was reassigned to Fort Fermont, another major installation along the line, where his engineering expertise was needed for upgrades to fire control systems. Before leaving Hackenberg, he spent an evening with Captain Arnoux discussing the strange events that had dominated the spring. The captain poured cognac from a bottle he kept for rare occasions, and the two officers talked late into the night. Moreau confessed that he had never fully accepted the psychological explanation for the voices. Too many details remained unexplained. The consistency of the reports, the timing that matched historical accounts of Margaret Keller's illness, the abrupt cessation after the burial. He believed something genuine had occurred, even if that something defied conventional understanding. Science could not explain everything, particularly phenomena that touched on consciousness and perception in ways that current knowledge did not accommodate. Arnoux listened and shared his own uncertainty. He was a practical man, trained to deal with concrete realities of military command. Yet he had heard the voice himself in Gallery 12. He had experienced something that had no place in his worldview. Whether it was a ghost or some unknown property of human psychology operating in the unique environment of the underground complex, he could not say. But it had been real in the moment, undeniably real, and that reality troubled him more than he cared to admit. They finished the cognac and shook hands. Moreau departed the next morning, carrying with him copies of all the documents related to the investigation. He promised to continue researching when opportunity allowed, though both men knew war would soon consume all available time and attention. The mystery of Margaret Keller would have to remain unsolved, at least for now. July brought new personnel to replace those transferred. Among them was Sergeant Claude Deschamps, a career soldier who had spent 15 years in various fortress commands. He was 41 years old, weathered and pragmatic, with the kind of stolid reliability that made him valuable in any garrison. Captain Arnoux assigned him to oversee the lower gallery maintenance crews, figuring his experience would be useful in managing the complex infrastructure. Deschamps settled into the routine quickly. He learned the tunnel layout, memorized the locations of critical systems, and developed efficient patrol schedules for his crews. The work was repetitive but necessary. Concrete required constant monitoring for cracks. Ventilation systems needed regular inspection. Electrical conduits had to be checked for moisture damage. The fort was a living machine that demanded perpetual attention. He heard the stories about the voices from soldiers who had been at Hackenberg during the spring. Most dismissed them as exaggerations or jokes, the kind of legends that grew naturally in isolated communities. A few spoke seriously about the incidents, describing genuine fear they had experienced. Deschamps listened without judgment. He had served long enough to know that strange things happened in military life, events that defied easy categorization. He neither believed nor disbelieved. He simply filed the information away and focused on his work. In early August, one of his maintenance crews reported an unusual finding in Gallery 9. During a routine inspection, they had discovered a section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped. The concrete appeared solid, but acoustically something seemed wrong. Deschamps investigated personally, bringing an engineer to assess the situation. The engineer confirmed the crew's observation. Behind the wall lay a void space, possibly a construction gap that had never been properly filled. Such things happened occasionally in massive projects where thousands of cubic meters of concrete were poured under time pressure. The void would need to be filled to maintain structural integrity, particularly if war came and the fort faced artillery bombardment. They brought drilling equipment and made a small exploratory hole. The bit punched through into empty space. Deschamps shone a light through the opening, expecting to see a narrow gap between concrete forms. Instead, his light revealed a chamber, roughly 3 meters square, that appeared to have been deliberately created rather than accidentally left. The discovery required investigation. Over the next 2 days, crews carefully enlarged the opening enough for a man to enter. Deschamps went in first, crawling through into the hidden chamber. His light played across walls that showed marks of hand tools, places where someone had chipped away at the rock before concrete was poured. The floor was uneven, natural stone rather than finished concrete. And against the far wall sat objects that made Deschamps call for Captain Arnoux immediately. 5 wooden crates occupied the chamber, stacked neatly and covered with canvas tarps that had protected them from moisture. The crates bore German markings, manufacturer stamps from companies in Bavaria and Prussia. Deschamps did not open them. He backed out of the chamber and reported to the captain, emphasizing that this looked like a deliberate cache, possibly espionage-related. Arnoux assembled a team including Dr. Roussel and the fort's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Bernard Colbert. They entered the chamber together and examined the crates carefully. Colbert noted the markings and estimated the crates dated from the early 1930s based on the style of manufacturing stamps. He recommended treating them as potentially dangerous until their contents could be verified. They brought 1 crate out and opened it in a secure room with appropriate precautions. Inside, packed in straw, they found not weapons or explosives but documents. Hundreds of documents, most in German, relating to industrial processes and manufacturing specifications. Technical manuals for machinery, blueprints for factories, correspondence between German companies and French intermediaries discussing trade agreements and technology sharing. The documents dated from 1931 through 1934, the height of economic cooperation between French and German industries before political tensions destroyed such relationships. Nothing in the papers appeared classified or military in nature. They were ordinary business documents, the kind that would have been filed in company archives under normal circumstances. Lieutenant Colbert could not explain why such materials would be hidden in a chamber at Fort Hackenberg. The documents had no obvious intelligence value. They revealed no secrets. They were simply records of legitimate commercial activity from half a decade earlier. Yet someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal them in the fort's walls. Dr. Roussel offered a hypothesis. During the 1930s, political sentiment in France had shifted dramatically regarding Germany. Businesses that had maintained German contacts found themselves under suspicion. Perhaps someone associated with the fort's construction had been involved in Franco-German trade and feared exposure. Hiding the documents would protect against accusations of enemy collaboration, even if the business itself was entirely legal. The remaining crates contained similar materials. Thousands of pages documenting industrial cooperation that now seemed embarrassing or potentially treasonous, given the current political climate. Captain Arnoux ordered the documents catalogued and sent to intelligence headquarters for analysis. He doubted they held any real secrets, but protocol demanded thorough review. The hidden chamber raised new questions about what else might be concealed in the fort's massive structure. If someone could create a secret room and hide crates without detection, what other modifications might exist? Arnoux ordered a comprehensive survey of all galleries, looking for anomalies in the walls or floor. The survey was time-consuming and took crews away from regular maintenance, but the captain deemed it necessary. They found 2 more hidden spaces over the following weeks. One in Gallery 15 contained nothing but empty wine bottles, evidence that workers had used the spot as a drinking hideout during construction. The other, in Gallery 7, held personal belongings, clothing, a few books, a small trunk with letters and photographs. The items appeared to have belonged to a construction worker who might have been living on site without authorization. Among the photographs was one that caught Dr. Roussel's attention. It showed a group of workers posed in front of the tunnel entrance, probably taken sometime in 1934 based on the construction progress visible in the background. About 20 men stood in work clothes, grinning at the camera. To one side, partially out of frame, stood a woman in an apron. The photograph was small and the image quality poor, but Roussel thought he could make out dark hair and a thin frame. He showed the photograph to Father Blanc, driving to Veckring specifically for this purpose. The priest examined it carefully, then nodded slowly. He could not be certain, but the woman might be the person he had administered last rites to in August 1934. The build seemed right. The general appearance matched his fragmentary memories. Roussel reported this to Captain Arnoux. They now had a photograph that might show Margaret Keller, though positive identification was impossible from such limited evidence. The photograph joined the small collection of materials related to her: the invoice, the priest's testimony, the artifacts found with her remains, pieces of a life that remained mostly obscure despite their best efforts to illuminate it. September arrived with news that made everything else seem trivial. Germany invaded Poland on the first day of the month. Britain and France declared war. 2 days later, the waiting was over. The conflict everyone had dreaded and anticipated was now reality. Fort Hackenberg went to full war footing. All leaves were cancelled. The garrison sealed itself underground, ready to resist the German assault that strategists predicted would come soon against the Maginot Line. But the assault did not come. Weeks passed with no major action on the Western Front. German forces concentrated on crushing Poland while French and British armies waited behind their fortifications. The period that would later be called the Phony War settled over the region, an eerie calm broken only by occasional patrol skirmishes and artillery exchanges. Life in Fort Hackenberg took on a strange quality during this time. The men were at war, technically, but fought no battles. They maintained weapons that fired only test rounds. They stood watches for attacks that never materialized. The isolation that had always characterized fort duty became more pronounced. No one entered or left except on official business. Supplies came through guarded convoys. Information from the outside world filtered through official channels, always delayed, always incomplete. In this environment, soldiers noticed things they might otherwise have ignored. Small details, odd occurrences, the sound of footsteps in empty corridors when everyone was accounted for, shadows that moved in peripheral vision but vanished when looked at directly. Cold spots in certain galleries where temperature should have been constant. None of it dramatic, nothing like the clear voices of the previous spring, but unsettling nonetheless. Corporal Dufour mentioned these observations to Sergeant Deschamps in October. The younger man seemed embarrassed to bring up such subjective experiences, but he insisted that something felt different in the tunnels. Other soldiers agreed when Deschamps asked discreetly. The fort did not feel right. One man described it as though the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. Deschamps reported to Captain Arnoux, framing it as a morale issue rather than anything supernatural. The captain listened and made a note to arrange for entertainment, perhaps bringing in a film projector or organizing sporting competitions. Anything to break the monotony and give the men something to focus on besides the oppressive atmosphere of their underground existence. But Arnoux felt it too. He had spent months at Fort Hackenberg and knew its rhythms, its sounds, its particular character. Something had changed since the discovery of the hidden chambers and the photograph. The fort felt different, not threatening exactly, but aware, as if the structure itself had woken from a long sleep and now paid attention to the men moving through its passages. He dismissed such thoughts as fatigue and stress. Command was exhausting during wartime, even when no fighting occurred. The responsibility for 1,000 lives, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that at any moment orders might come sending them into battle, all of it wore on him. He was imagining things, projecting his anxiety onto concrete and stone. Yet the feeling persisted. Walking through Gallery 12 late one night, Arnoux stopped and stood motionless for several minutes. He heard the usual mechanical sounds. He saw the usual shadows cast by overhead lights. Everything appeared normal. But he felt watched. He felt presence. Something or someone occupied the space around him, invisible but undeniable. He shook his head and continued walking. Lack of sleep and too much coffee. He needed rest. They all needed rest, but rest was a luxury that war did not permit. November brought cold that penetrated the fort's insulation. The heating system struggled to maintain livable temperatures. Soldiers bundled in extra layers and learned to sleep in the constant chill. Ice formed on walls near the surface blocks, where outside air found paths through ventilation shafts. The galleries became even more unpleasant, wet and cold and oppressive. Private Fontaine was conducting an inspection in Gallery 23 when his light failed. The batteries died suddenly, plunging him into darkness, broken only by the distant glow of overhead bulbs far down the tunnel. He stood still, waiting for his eyes to adjust, reaching into his pack for replacement batteries. As he worked by feel to change them, he heard breathing. Not his own breathing. Someone else's, close enough that he should be able to reach out and touch them. He called out, asking who was there. No response. Just the sound of breathing, steady and slow. He got his light working again and swept it around the gallery. Empty. Completely empty, but the breathing continued for several seconds more before fading away. Fontaine reported the incident, though he expected skepticism. Instead, Sergeant Deschamps listened seriously and asked detailed questions about the exact location and time. Fontaine was the 4th soldier to report unusual auditory experiences in the previous week. No voices this time, but sounds that should not exist in empty tunnels. Breathing, footsteps, what one man described as quiet crying. Captain Arnoux convened his senior staff to discuss the situation. The voices had returned, or something like them had. Different in character from the spring phenomenon, but equally unexplained and equally disturbing to garrison morale. Dr. Roussel suggested carbon monoxide testing again, though previous tests had shown nothing. Lieutenant Kolber wondered if German psychological operations might have escalated, though how the enemy could project sounds into a sealed fortress remained unclear. Sergeant Deschamps offered a different perspective. He was not an educated man, but he had 41 years of life experience and 15 years of military service. He had learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong at Fort Hackenberg, and it was not mechanical failure or enemy action. The place felt haunted. He used that word deliberately, knowing how it would sound. Haunted, not by one ghost, but by something larger, as if the fort itself had accumulated spiritual weight from all the human activity and emotion poured into its construction and occupation. The room fell silent. Captain Arnoux looked at his sergeant, a reliable man who had never shown any tendency toward superstition or fantasy. The fact that Deschamps would make such a statement carried significance. Other officers shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to acknowledge what was being suggested, but no one could offer a better explanation. Dr. Roussel finally spoke. Perhaps they were dealing with something that existed in the space between psychology and objective reality. The fort was a place of intense human focus. Thousands of workers had built it under dangerous conditions. Many had died. Now hundreds of soldiers lived there under constant stress, waiting for war while isolated from normal life. All of that human experience, all that fear and hope and effort might create something. Not a ghost in the traditional sense, but an accumulation of psychic energy that manifested in ways current science could not measure or explain. It was speculation, untestable and unfalsifiable. But it was something. An acknowledgement that normal explanations were insufficient. Captain Arnoux thanked his staff and dismissed them. He sat alone in his office afterward, thinking about what it meant to command men in a place that might be haunted, if such a thing was even possible. He had no answer. He had only duty and the determination to keep his garrison functional regardless of what strangeness they faced. Winter came to Lorraine with brutal cold that turned the landscape into a frozen wasteland. Above ground, snow covered the hills and forests surrounding Fort Hackenberg. Below ground, the temperature dropped despite the heating systems running continuously. Ice formed on metal surfaces. Moisture condensed and froze in the ventilation ducts. The concrete walls seemed to radiate cold, as if the earth itself had become hostile to human presence. December of 1939 marked the 4th month of the war, and still no major combat had reached the Maginot Line. French forces conducted limited patrols into German territory. German forces responded with their own probes. But the expected massive assault never came. Both sides waited, building strength, planning operations that would come in spring when weather improved. The garrison at Fort Hackenberg remained on high alert, despite the lack of action, knowing that the calm could shatter at any moment. The sounds in the tunnels intensified as the year drew to its close. What had been occasional incidents became nightly occurrences. Soldiers reported hearing conversations in galleries they knew were empty. Not whispers this time, but full voices speaking in tones too low to make out individual words. The conversations seemed to move through the fort, starting in one section and drifting to another. Men on patrol would hear them approaching, growing louder, then fading as they passed by like invisible groups walking unseen paths. Corporal Victor Blanc was standing watch at the entrance to Gallery 15 on the night of December 18th when he heard the most distinct manifestation yet. Multiple voices, at least 5 or 6, speaking French with the casual rhythm of workers talking during a break. They discussed ordinary things, the weather, food, complaints about working conditions. The voices came from inside the gallery, moving toward him. He raised his rifle and challenged them, demanding identification. The voices stopped immediately. Silence returned. Blanc entered the gallery with his light and weapon ready. He found nothing. The tunnel stretched empty in both directions. He reported to Sergeant Deschamps, who was beginning to keep a separate log of these incidents apart from official records. The sergeant had filled nearly 30 pages with accounts from different soldiers describing similar experiences. The pattern was clear. The fort was experiencing an escalation of whatever phenomenon had begun with Margareta Keller's voice in the spring. Deschamps showed the log to Captain Arnoux, who read through it with growing concern. The captain faced a dilemma. He could not ignore the situation, as it clearly affected his garrison's mental state. But he also could not report it to regional command without sounding incompetent or unstable. The military had no protocol for dealing with haunted fortifications. Any official acknowledgement would likely result in his relief from command, and possibly medical evaluation. Yet the problem was real and getting worse. He decided on a different approach. He contacted Father Michel Arnaud, the military chaplain who had conducted the burial service for Margareta Keller's remains in March. The priest returned to Fort Hackenberg in late December and listened as Arnaud described the escalating phenomena. Father Arnaud asked to tour the galleries where incidents occurred most frequently, and the captain personally escorted him through the underground complex. They walked Gallery 12 first, where the original voice had been heard. Father Arnaud paused periodically, standing silent with his eyes closed, as if listening for something beyond normal hearing. He carried a small leather case containing items for religious services, holy water, blessed salt, a Bible, and other materials. In the middle of the gallery, where Corporal Dufour had first encountered the voice, the priest stopped and remained motionless for several minutes. When he finally spoke, Father Arnaud said the place felt heavy. That was the word he used. Heavy. As if gravity had increased or the air had thickened. He could not explain it better than that, but he trusted his impression. Something resided here, or had left its mark in a way that lingered. He opened his case and performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water on the floor and walls while reciting prayers in Latin. Captain Arnaud watched, feeling simultaneously foolish and grateful. They visited Gallery 9 next, then Gallery 15, then several other locations where incidents had been reported. Father Arnaud performed the same blessing ritual at each site. The process took most of a day. Soldiers watched curiously as the priest moved through their domain, marking it with religious symbols and prayers. Some seemed comforted by his presence. Others appeared skeptical, but no one mocked or complained. They all wanted the strangeness to end. On December the 22nd, Father Arnaud conducted a mass in the fort's small chapel, a room barely large enough to hold 50 men. Over 200 soldiers attended, cramming into the space and spilling out into the corridor. The priest spoke about fear and faith, about the seen and unseen worlds, about finding courage in the presence of mystery. He did not mention ghosts or hauntings explicitly, but everyone understood the subtext. He was acknowledging their experiences while offering spiritual framework for understanding them. After the Mass, the priest met privately with Captain Arnaud. He explained that he could not say definitively whether the fort was haunted in any supernatural sense. The Church recognized that unexplained phenomena occurred, that the world held mysteries beyond human comprehension. But the Church also taught that such mysteries should not be feared if one maintained faith. The blessings he had performed were intended to sanctify the space, to mark it as holy ground where evil or unrest could not easily take root. Whether this would have any practical effect depended on factors he could not control or predict. The captain thanked him for coming. Father Arnaud departed the next day, leaving behind blessed candles and instructions for prayers that could be recited if the phenomena continued. Arnaud distributed the candles to soldiers who wanted them and made copies of the prayers available. He did not make participation mandatory, respecting that his garrison included men of various beliefs and none. But most took the candles, most copied the prayers. In a situation where nothing else seemed to work, spiritual protection felt better than no protection at all. Christmas came to Fort Hackenberg with an attempt at celebration despite the circumstances. The kitchen staff prepared special meals using hoarded supplies. Someone found a small tree and decorated it with improvised ornaments. Soldiers sang carols in the mess hall, their voices echoing through the concrete spaces. For a brief time, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Men laughed and shared stories. The war and the strangeness seemed distant, but that night, the phenomena returned stronger than before. Over a dozen soldiers reported encounters with voices, footsteps, or other unexplained sounds. Private André Fontaine was in Gallery 23, the tunnel where Margaret Gay. Keller's remains had been found when he heard what sounded like digging. The rhythmic sound of a shovel striking earth over and over. He investigated but found no source. The sound continued around him, directionless, until it gradually faded after several minutes. Sergeant Paul Mercier heard breathing again, but this time accompanied by words. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, saying something in German that he could not understand. He noted the time, 2:37 in the morning. almost exactly the time when Captain Arnoux had heard Margaret Keller's voice in February. The coincidence seemed unlikely to be accidental. On December 27th, Corporal Thomas Gerard was walking through Gallery 9 when he saw something that made him stop breathing. A figure stood at the far end of the tunnel, perhaps 80 meters away. Backlit by the overhead lamps, details were impossible to make out, but the silhouette appeared to be a woman in working clothes. She stood motionless for several seconds, then turned and walked into a side passage. Gerard ran after her, covering the distance in seconds. When he reached the side passage, he found it sealed, a metal door, locked, that had not been opened in months based on the dust accumulated at its base. No one could have gone through it. He reported the sighting immediately. Captain Arnoux ordered a search of the entire section, checking every possible hiding place. They found nothing, no trace of anyone passing through the area. The sealed door remained locked from the outside. Whoever or whatever Gerard had seen existed outside normal physical constraints. The incident marked a turning point. Until now, the phenomena had been primarily auditory. Voices, footsteps, breathing, but nothing visible. Now soldiers were reporting visual manifestations, actual sightings of figures that should not exist. 3 more men came forward over the next week describing similar experiences. A woman seen briefly in distant galleries, always too far away to make out features, always vanishing before she could be approached. Dr. Roussel suggested mass hallucination brought on by stress and suggestion. The possibility could not be dismissed. The garrison lived under enormous psychological pressure, isolated underground, waiting for war while experiencing unexplained phenomena. Human perception was not reliable under such conditions. What one man thought he saw might be nothing more than shadow and expectation combining to create false impressions. But Corporal Gerard insisted he had seen something real. He was not prone to imagination or exaggeration. His service record showed steady reliability. He had run toward the figure with his eyes open and focused. It was not peripheral vision or mistaken identity. Someone had stood in that gallery and then disappeared in a manner that violated physical possibility. Lieutenant Bernard Colbert proposed a different theory. Perhaps the Germans had developed infiltration techniques that allowed agents to penetrate even the sealed environment of the Maginot Line fortifications. If they could place someone inside Fort Hackenberg, that person could gather intelligence and potentially sabotage critical systems. The appearances soldiers reported might be glimpses of this infiltrator who moved through the tunnels using hidden passages or access routes unknown to current personnel. The theory had enough plausibility that Captain Arnoux ordered a comprehensive security review. Teams checked every sealed door, every ventilation shaft, every potential entry point. They found nothing suspicious. The fort remained secure. No unauthorized personnel could have entered. The idea of a German infiltrator dissolved under scrutiny, unable to account for how such a person could appear and disappear in locked sections without leaving traces. January of 1940 brought no answers, only more questions. The phenomena continued with disturbing regularity. Soldiers learned to live with the strangeness, developing coping mechanisms and shared protocols. Men avoided walking alone in certain galleries. They sang or talked loudly when on solo patrol, as if noise could ward off the unexplained presences. Some carried the blessed candles Father Arnaud had provided, lighting them when fear became too intense. Morale suffered despite these adaptations. Transfer requests increased. Medical complaints multiplied as men developed stress-related symptoms, insomnia, anxiety, difficulty concentrating. Dr. Roussel treated what he could but recognized that the underlying cause was environmental. The fort itself had become the problem, and no medical intervention could address that. Captain Arnoux found himself documenting everything meticulously in his private journal, knowing that someday, somehow, this record might be needed. He wrote about the voices, the sightings, the attempts at explanation and intervention. He wrote about his own experiences, the times he felt watched or heard sounds that had no source. He wrote about the discovery of Margaret Keller's grave and the strange peace that had followed, only to be broken by the new wave of phenomena in autumn. He wrote about a theory that had begun forming in his mind, unsupported by evidence but persistent nonetheless. Perhaps the fort was not haunted by a single ghost, but by something more complex. The place had been built through enormous human effort and sacrifice. Workers had died during construction. Now soldiers lived there under the shadow of impending war, their emotions concentrated by isolation and fear. All of that human experience, all that pain and hope and determination might have soaked into the concrete and steel, creating a kind of psychic imprint that occasionally manifested in perceptible ways. It was not a scientific theory. It was barely coherent as speculation, but it helped him make sense of why the phenomena seemed layered, multiple, as if different presences occupied the fort at different times. Margaret Keller's voice had been specific, consistent, identifiable. The current phenomena were more varied, more diffuse, as if the fort was remembering many people and many moments rather than channeling a single consciousness. He shared this theory with no one. It sounded absurd even in his own mind, but it gave him a framework for understanding, and that framework helped him maintain command presence. He could not explain the phenomena to his men, could not reassure them that everything would be normal again soon. But he could demonstrate that he was not afraid, that he remained in control, that the fort's strangeness would not prevent them from accomplishing their mission. February arrived, marking 1 year since the voices had first been reported. The anniversary seemed to trigger intensification. Incidents occurred almost hourly. Soldiers reported hearing entire conversations, seeing multiple figures, feeling physical sensations like hands touching their shoulders or breath on their necks. The distinction between psychological phenomena and objective reality became impossible to maintain. Too many men experienced too many things with too much consistency for it all to be hallucination. On February the 14th, exactly 1 year after Captain Arnoux had heard Margaret Keller's voice in Gallery 12, something unprecedented happened. The fort's electric lights flickered throughout the entire complex, dimming and brightening in a pattern that followed no mechanical explanation. The phenomenon lasted approximately 90 seconds. Every soldier on duty noticed it. The maintenance crews checked the generators and found them operating normally. The voltage regulators showed no fluctuations. Yet the lights had undeniably flickered in a coordinated manner that affected the entire installation simultaneously. Sergeant Deschamps was in Gallery 15 when it happened. As the lights dimmed, he heard voices all around him. Not whispers or distant conversation, but clear speech in multiple languages, French, German, and others he could not identify. The voices overlapped, creating a chaotic chorus that filled the tunnel. He stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Then the lights stabilized, and silence returned. He found himself alone in an empty gallery, with nothing but the normal hum of machinery. He was not the only one. Reports flooded in from throughout the fort. During those 90 seconds of flickering light, dozens of soldiers had heard voices, seen figures, or experienced other phenomena. It was as if the entire underground complex had briefly become transparent to some other layer of reality, allowing glimpses of presences that normally remained hidden. Captain Arnoux gathered his senior staff and demanded explanations. No one could provide them. The event had been witnessed by too many people to dismiss. The electrical anomaly had been real and measurable. Something had happened that transcended psychological explanation. The fort had manifested behavior that resembled consciousness or intentionality, as if the structure itself had acted rather than simply hosting unexplained phenomena. In the aftermath, a strange calm settled over Fort Hackenberg. The phenomena did not stop entirely, but they decreased in frequency and intensity. It was as if the February 14th event had been a culmination, a peak after which energy gradually dissipated. Soldiers continued reporting occasional incidents through March, but they became rare enough that normal routines could resume without constant disruption. Spring of 1940 arrived with weather that transformed the frozen landscape into a world of mud and early flowers. The snow melted rapidly as March temperatures rose, sending water streaming down the hills and into the valleys surrounding Fort Hackenberg. Above ground, the world awakened from winter dormancy. Below ground, the garrison maintained its vigilance, aware that spring traditionally marked the beginning of military campaigns. The phony war could not last forever. Soon, very soon, the real fighting would begin. The phenomena in the tunnels had subsided to a level that soldiers could almost ignore. Occasional sounds still echoed through empty galleries, and some men reported brief sightings of shadows that moved against the light. But the intensity of December and January had passed. The fort felt quieter, as if whatever presence had manifested so strongly in midwinter had exhausted itself or retreated to wherever such things resided when not making themselves known to human perception. Captain Arnoux used this relative calm to focus on practical preparations. Supply lines needed verification, ammunition stocks required inventory, communication systems had to be tested and retested. The Maginot Line was about to face its ultimate test, the purpose for which it had been built. Everything had to function perfectly when the moment came. There was no room for error, no tolerance for equipment failure or human hesitation. Corporal Henri Dufour received promotion to sergeant in early April, recognition for his steady performance during the difficult winter months. He had been among the first to report the voices over a year ago, and he had maintained his composure through all the subsequent strangeness. Captain Arnoux valued such reliability. The garrison needed leaders who could function regardless of circumstances, who could set examples of calm professionalism even when faced with the inexplicable. Dufour's new responsibilities included training recent arrivals, soldiers transferred to Fort Hackenberg as part of the spring reinforcement. These men knew nothing of the voices and sightings, and Dufour was instructed not to mention them. The official position was that the incidents had been isolated events, now resolved, not worth discussing. The new personnel should focus on their duties without being primed to expect unusual phenomena. But the old garrison members talked among themselves when officers were not present. Stories spread through the barracks, growing in the telling as stories always did. The new arrivals heard about the woman's voice asking for water, about the figure seen in Gallery 9, about the night when lights flickered and the entire fort seemed to come alive with unseen presences. Some dismissed these tales as legend and exaggeration. Others listened with growing unease, wondering what kind of place they had been assigned to. Private Marcel Beaumont was among the new arrivals. He was 19 years old, conscripted from a village in Burgundy, with no military experience beyond basic training. Fort Hackenberg intimidated him from the moment he entered its underground maze. The tunnels stretched endlessly in every direction. The mechanical sounds seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The air tasted stale despite the ventilation, and the older soldiers watched him with expressions that suggested they knew things he did not, things they chose not to share. He was assigned to a maintenance crew under Sergeant Deschamps, learning the basics of tunnel inspection and system monitoring. The work was tedious but necessary. Beaumont walked kilometers each day through the galleries, checking pipes for leaks, examining walls for cracks, testing lights and communication lines. The routine gradually became familiar. The fort's layout began making sense to him. The initial intimidation faded into acceptance. On April 23rd, while conducting an inspection in Gallery 12, Beaumont noticed something scratched into the concrete wall. Someone had carved words using a sharp tool, probably during construction. The lettering was crude but legible. Here lies Margaret, forgotten but not gone. Below this, a date, August 1934. Beaumont traced the letters with his finger, wondering who had made this inscription and why. The date meant nothing to him. The name meant nothing. Just graffiti left by a long-ago worker. He mentioned it to Sergeant Deschamps during their next meeting. The sergeant's expression changed immediately. He asked Beaumont to show him the exact location. They returned to Gallery 12 together, and Deschamps examined the carving carefully. The inscription had been there for 6 years, hidden in plain sight. Thousands of soldiers had walked past it without noticing or without caring if they did notice. But now, given everything that had happened, it took on new significance. Deschamps reported the finding to Captain Arnoux. The captain came to see it himself, standing in the gallery with a flashlight trained on the wall. The carving was positioned about eye level, perhaps 3 meters from where Corporal Dufour had first heard the voice. Someone who knew about Margaret Keller's death had memorialized her here, in the place where she had worked and possibly died. The inscription suggested that at least a few people remembered her, even if official records did not. But who had made the carving? Construction workers, most likely, though identifying a specific individual after 6 years seemed impossible. The inscription represented a small act of remembrance, a refusal to let someone vanish completely from human memory. Captain Arnoux found himself moved by this gesture, anonymous and crude though it was. Someone had cared enough to mark the place. Someone had ensured that Margareta Keller's name remained visible. He ordered the section of wall photographed and documented. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He arranged for a small plaque to be made, a proper memorial that would formalize what the anonymous worker had begun. The plaque bore Margaret Keller's name, the estimated dates of her life based on Father Blanc's description, and a simple inscription: "In memory of those who built these walls and rest within them." It was deliberately vague, honoring her without raising questions about how or why she had been buried in the tunnels. The plaque was installed in Gallery 12 on May 1st. Father Michel Arnaud returned to conduct a brief dedication ceremony. A small group attended: Captain Arnoux, Sergeant Deschamps, Corporal Dufour, Dr. Roussel, and a few others who had been involved in the investigation. The priest blessed the memorial and said prayers for the dead. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt significant. They had acknowledged Margaret Keller officially, permanently, in a way that could not be forgotten or erased. That night, the fort remained completely quiet. No voices echoed through empty galleries. No footsteps sounded in sealed tunnels. No figures appeared in distant shadows. Soldiers on patrol reported nothing unusual. The silence felt different from previous quiet periods, more complete somehow, as if a tension that had defined the place for over a year had finally released. The calm persisted through the first week of May. Garrison life took on a normalcy that felt almost strange after months of unexplained phenomena. Soldiers performed their duties without the underlying anxiety that had colored every action since the previous winter. The fort became simply a military installation again, nothing more than concrete and steel and the men who occupied it. On May 10th, Germany launched its Western offensive. German forces invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in a massive coordinated assault that shattered the phony war's eerie stalemate. News reached Fort Hackenberg through military channels. The moment they had prepared for had arrived. The Maginot Line would now fulfill its purpose, holding the German army away from French territory, while mobile forces engaged in Belgium. Fort Hackenberg went to combat status. All non-essential activities ceased. The garrison manned battle stations, ready to engage any German units that approached their sector. Artillery crews loaded shells into the massive guns. Observers scanned the approaches through periscopes and rangefinders. The fort transformed from a waiting position into an active weapon, poised to deliver devastating firepower against any enemy who dared challenge it. But the attack never came to their sector. German strategy bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, concentrating forces through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. The strongest fortifications in the world stood useless as the Wehrmacht swept around them, driving deep into France through routes the defensive planners had deemed impassable. Fort Hackenberg and its sister installations waited in readiness while the real battle raged hundreds of kilometers to the north. The garrison listened to fragmentary reports from the front. French and British forces engaged the Germans in Belgium. The fighting was fierce, casualties mounting on both sides. But the German advance continued relentlessly, pushing through defenses that were supposed to hold. The speed of the offensive shocked military observers. Nothing like this had occurred during the Great War. The Germans had learned mobility, had perfected combined arms tactics that rendered static fortifications irrelevant. Captain Arnoux understood what was happening even before official confirmation came. The Maginot Line had failed not through weakness, but through irrelevance. The Germans had simply gone around it, making the massive investment of money and effort pointless. France had built the wrong defenses for the wrong war. His garrison sat uselessly in their underground fortress while the nation fell apart beyond its walls. The realization was bitter. They had endured isolation, had faced inexplicable phenomena, had maintained readiness through months of waiting, and now would likely never fire a shot in anger. The fort that was supposed to save France would instead become its monument, a symbol of strategic failure and misplaced confidence. May turned into a nightmare of cascading defeats. German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off Allied armies in Belgium. The British began evacuating from Dunkirk. French defenses collapsed as the Wehrmacht pivoted south, driving toward Paris. Fort Hackenberg remained at battle stations, its guns silent, its garrison helpless to affect events beyond their immediate area. Sergeant Dufour walked through Gallery 12 during a rest period, finding himself standing before the memorial plaque. He read Margaret Keller's name, and thought about the strange year that had passed since her grave was discovered. The voices and sightings seemed distant now, almost dreamlike, as if they had occurred in some other time and place. Reality had become the crashing defeat of French arms, the dissolution of everything they had believed secure. He wondered if Margaret Keller's spirit, if such a thing existed, had been trying to warn them. The voice asking about poisoned water might have been metaphor, a message about corrupted foundations and deadly errors. They had sought clean water, sought purity and security in their concrete fortifications. But the water was poisoned from the start. The entire strategic concept was flawed. They had built magnificently and built wrong. It was a poetic interpretation, probably nonsense. The voices had likely been nothing more than stress-induced hallucination, suggestion and expectation creating shared delusions. But Dufour found himself wanting to believe in a different explanation. He wanted to think that something had tried to reach them, to prepare them somehow for the catastrophe that was unfolding. It made the strangeness meaningful rather than simply disturbing. Private Beaumont stood watch at one of the fort's observation posts on June 1st, watching German columns moving in the distance. They were not approaching Fort Hackenberg. They were bypassing it, heading south along roads that led deeper into France. The garrison could have engaged them, could have brought artillery fire down on those columns. But orders from regional command were clear. Conserve ammunition, maintain defensive posture, wait for instructions. The Germans ignored the fort, and the fort ignored the Germans, both parties understanding that the real battle was occurring elsewhere. June brought the collapse. German forces entered Paris on the 14th. The government fled south. Marshal Pétain assumed leadership and began negotiating armistice. France had fallen in 6 weeks, a defeat more complete and humiliating than anyone had imagined possible. The Maginot Line stood intact and useless, its garrisons manning positions that no longer mattered. Fort Hackenberg received orders to cease hostilities on June 25th. The armistice had been signed. The war, at least France's part in it, was over. Soldiers stood in stunned silence as the announcement was read. They had lost without fighting. They had prepared so thoroughly, had endured so much, and accomplished nothing. The garrison was to remain in place until German forces arrived to take control of the installation. Captain Arnoux gathered his officers for a final staff meeting. They discussed practical matters, how to secure equipment, what records to preserve or destroy, how to prepare for surrender. The conversation was mechanical, everyone avoiding the deeper questions about failure and what came next. When the meeting ended, Arnoux remained alone in his office, looking at the maps and charts that covered the walls. All that planning, all that effort, rendered meaningless by strategic blindness at the highest levels. He thought about the year of voices and visions, about Margaret Keller and the memorial plaque that now marked Gallery 12. Perhaps the fort had been trying to speak to them all along, trying to tell them that even the strongest walls could not prevent defeat if the enemy simply walked around them. Or perhaps it had been nothing but nerves and isolation, the mind playing tricks in an environment designed to strain human psychology. He would never know. The investigation was incomplete, the phenomena unexplained. And now it no longer mattered. History would remember the Maginot Line as a failure, as a symbol of French military incompetence. The voices in the tunnels would be forgotten if they were ever recorded at all. Margaret Keller would remain a mystery, her death and burial and strange posthumous presence known only to the few men who had experienced it directly. On June 28th, German troops arrived at Fort Hackenberg. The garrison assembled in full uniform and surrendered formally. Captain Arnoux presented his sword to the German commander, a colonel whose name he did not catch. The ritual was brief and professional. The Germans took control of the fort, and the French soldiers began the process of becoming prisoners of war. As Arnoux walked through the galleries one final time, now as a prisoner rather than commander, he paused at the memorial plaque. The Germans would probably remove it, not understanding its significance. Margaret Keller would be forgotten again, her brief acknowledgement erased, but for now, the plaque remained. Her name stayed visible on the concrete wall. Someone had cared enough to remember her. That would have to be enough. The German occupation of Fort Hackenberg transformed the installation from a symbol of French military pride into a strategic asset of the Wehrmacht. German engineers studied the fortification's design with professional admiration, noting the sophistication of its systems and the thoroughness of its construction. They found the Maginot Line installations to be masterpieces of defensive engineering, exactly as effective as their designers had intended. The tragedy was not in the building, but in the using, in strategic doctrine that failed to account for an enemy who would simply refuse to attack where France was strongest. The French garrison was transported to prisoner-of-war camps in Germany. Captain Arnoux found himself in a camp near Frankfurt, sharing barracks with other captured officers. The men talked endlessly about the campaign, analyzing what had gone wrong, assigning blame to politicians and generals who had led France to catastrophe. Arnoux participated in these discussions, but found his thoughts returning to Fort Hackenberg and the year of strange phenomena that had preceded the defeat. He had brought his journal with him, concealed among personal effects that the Germans had not confiscated. During the long, empty hours of captivity, he worked on organizing his notes, expanding entries where memory provided additional details. The account grew to over 200 pages. A comprehensive record of the voices and sightings and the investigation into Margaret. He wrote not for any audience but for himself, trying to make sense of experiences that had defied explanation. Sergeant Deschamps was in a different camp, somewhere in Bavaria. He had been separated from most of the Fort Hackenberg garrison during the initial processing of prisoners. The camp held several thousand French soldiers, packed into inadequate barracks and given minimal rations. Morale was terrible. Many men sank into depression, unable to cope with the combination of defeat and captivity. Deschamps maintained his discipline, rising each day and performing whatever tasks the Germans assigned. It was the only way he knew to survive. He thought often about the fort and the phenomena they had witnessed. In the camp environment, with its constant noise and activity and lack of privacy, the memories seemed unreal. Had they actually heard voices in empty tunnels? Had figures actually appeared in sealed galleries? Or had isolation and stress created shared delusions that felt real in the moment but dissolved under scrutiny? He could no longer be certain. Memory was unreliable, especially when processed through the trauma of defeat and imprisonment. Corporal Dufour, now permanently a sergeant, though the rank meant nothing in captivity, was in a third camp near Munich. He had been assigned to a work detail, spending his days performing manual labor at a nearby factory. The work was exhausting and the treatment harsh, but it gave structure to existence. He endured by focusing on small goals, surviving each day, maintaining health, keeping hope alive that eventually the war would end and he could return home. He rarely thought about Fort Hackenberg. The memories were too painful, too associated with the failure that had led to his current circumstances. When he did remember, it was Margaret Keller's voice he recalled most clearly. The words she had spoken that night in Gallery 12. "Where is the water? I must find water before dawn." The phrasing had seemed odd at the time. Now it seemed prophetic. France had sought security, had sought the clean water of safety behind impregnable walls, but the water was poisoned by faulty strategy. Dawn had come in the form of German tanks, and France had not been ready. Private Beaumont was among the youngest prisoners, barely 20 years old, trying to comprehend how his life had been so completely upended. He had been a soldier for less than a year, most of it spent in the underground isolation of Fort Hackenberg. He had experienced things he could not explain and witnessed the defeat of his nation before he fully understood what being a soldier meant. The camp existence numbed him. He followed orders mechanically and tried not to think about the future. The memorial plaque in Gallery 12 remained in place longer than Captain Arnoux had expected. German forces occupying the fort found it during their initial survey, but left it undisturbed. The inscription was vague enough that it did not obviously refer to any specific person or event. It simply acknowledged those who had built the fortification. The Germans saw no reason to remove what appeared to be a harmless memorial. But in September of 1940, during routine maintenance, German engineers discovered something that French forces had never found. Behind a wall in Gallery 18, they located another hidden chamber, this one larger than the spaces discovered by the French. The chamber contained the bodies of 3 men, all construction workers, based on their clothing and the tools found with them. The bodies were partially mummified by the dry environment, preserved well enough that cause of death could be determined. They had been crushed when part of the tunnel collapsed during excavation. The discovery required investigation. German military police examined the site and determined that the collapse had occurred during the fort's construction, probably in 1933 or 34. Rather than report the accident and deal with the resulting delays and investigations, someone had sealed the chamber and concealed it. The bodies had remained hidden for 7 years. The German authorities documented the finding and arranged for proper burial, including notification to French civil authorities about the recovered remains. The incident reached Captain Arnoux through the camp's information network. Prisoners received limited news about events outside, but information about the Maginot Line circulated because so many imprisoned soldiers had served there. Arnoux learned that Fort Hackenberg had yielded more hidden graves, more evidence that the construction had been marked by deaths that were never properly acknowledged. He wondered how many other bodies might be concealed in the fort's massive structure, how many workers had died and been quietly disposed of to avoid complications. He added this information to his journal, noting the pattern. The fort was built on hidden deaths, on sacrifices that were never honored. Perhaps that was why it had felt haunted. Perhaps the voices and visions were not supernatural phenomena, but psychological responses to unconscious knowledge that the place was essentially a tomb, that its walls contained human remains that had never been properly memorialized. The garrison had lived surrounded by the dead without knowing it. That knowledge, even if not consciously recognized, might have manifested in the strange experiences they reported. It was another theory, no more provable than any other. Arnoux recorded it and moved on to documenting other aspects of the fort's history. The journal became his project, the task that gave meaning to the empty hours of captivity. He interviewed other prisoners who had served at Fort Hackenberg, collecting their memories and experiences. Many had stories about the voices and phenomena. Some had explanations or theories. Others simply recounted what they had witnessed without trying to interpret it. The year 1941 brought changes to the camps. Some prisoners were released, usually older men, or those with medical conditions that made them unsuitable for work. Others were transferred to different locations as German labor needs shifted. The French government in Vichy negotiated for better treatment of prisoners. achieving modest improvements in conditions. Life in the camps remained difficult but became slightly more bearable. Dr. Roussel was among those released in early 1941 due to age and health considerations. He returned to France and found employment at a hospital in Lyon, resuming his medical practice under the occupation. He carried with him memories of Fort Hackenberg and the investigation into the voices. Occasionally, he spoke with colleagues about the experiences, framing them as interesting case studies in military psychology. Most listeners dismissed the stories as wartime stress and imagination. A few found them genuinely intriguing and pressed for details. In 1943, Roussel was contacted by a researcher from the Sorbonne who was studying psychological phenomena in military environments. The researcher had heard rumors about strange occurrences at Maginot Line fortifications and wanted to document them systematically. Roussel agreed to be interviewed and provided detailed accounts of everything he had witnessed and investigated. The researcher took extensive notes and promised to include the material in a planned book about military psychology. The book was never published. Allied bombing raids destroyed the researcher's apartment in 1944, and all his notes and manuscript materials were lost. Roussel learned of this after the liberation and felt a pang of regret. The Fort Hackenberg story would remain untold, at least in any formal academic context. He still had his own memories, but without corroboration from other witnesses or official documentation, the account would likely be dismissed as anecdote rather than accepted as serious case study. Captain Arnoux was liberated in April of 1945 when Allied forces overran his prison camp. He returned to France weighing 20 kilos less than when he had been captured, suffering from malnutrition and various health issues caused by 5 years of inadequate food and poor conditions. But he had survived, and he still possessed his journal. The pages were worn and stained, the binding barely holding together, but the text remained legible. He attempted to publish the journal in 1946, approaching several publishers with what he described as an important historical document about the Maginot Line. Every publisher rejected it. The French public had no interest in reading about the fortifications that had failed to protect the nation. The Maginot Line had become synonymous with strategic incompetence and false confidence. Any book about it would be commercially unsuccessful regardless of its content. The strange phenomena Arnoux described were simply too bizarre to be credible. Readers would assume he had invented them or exaggerated minor incidents into dramatic narratives. Arnoux eventually donated the journal to a military archive, where it was catalogued and stored among thousands of other personal accounts from the war. Researchers occasionally consulted it, but most found the material about voices and hauntings to be embarrassing, the kind of superstitious nonsense that undermined the document's credibility. The portions dealing with fort operations and the experience of captivity were considered more valuable, but even those sections were judged to be less useful than other available sources. Sergeant Deschamps returned to civilian life and never spoke about Fort Hackenberg to anyone outside his immediate family. His wife knew he had served there and had been captured when France fell. She knew captivity had been difficult, but he did not share details about the voices or the investigation into Margaret Keller. Those memories belonged to a chapter of his life that he preferred to close. He worked for 30 years as a mechanic in a small town in Normandy, raised 3 children, and died in 1976 without ever returning to Lorraine or the site of the fort. Sergeant Dufour likewise avoided discussing his war experiences. He had been wounded during a failed escape attempt from his prison camp in 1943, suffering injuries that left him with a permanent limp. After liberation, he returned to his family's farm in Brittany and spent the remainder of his life in agriculture. The memories of the underground fortress and its strange phenomena faded over time, becoming dreamlike and uncertain. By the time he died in 1981, he could no longer distinguish clearly between what he had actually experienced and what he had heard from other soldiers or imagined in retrospect. Private Beaumont left military service as soon as possible after the war and pursued education that had been interrupted by conscription. He attended university, studied literature, and became a teacher. In the 1960s, while teaching at a lycée in Paris, He mentioned Fort Hackenberg to a colleague who expressed interest in military history. The colleague pressed for details, and Beaumont found himself recounting the story of the voices and the investigation. The colleague was skeptical, but intrigued. He contacted other survivors of the fort's garrison, finding several who still lived in the Paris area. Over the course of a year, he interviewed 5 former soldiers who had served at Fort Hackenberg during the relevant period. All confirmed that strange phenomena had been reported. All described similar experiences: voices in empty tunnels, unexplained sounds, occasional sightings of figures that vanished. Their accounts corroborated each other despite having been given independently. The colleague wrote an article for a small military history journal published in 1967. The article presented the Fort Hackenberg phenomena as an interesting case study in how isolation and stress could create shared psychological experiences in military units. The tone was academic and slightly dismissive, treating the soldiers' reports as examples of mass suggestion rather than genuine mysteries. But the article at least documented the events, ensuring they would be remembered in some form. Fort Hackenberg itself survived the war intact. German forces evacuated it in late 1944 as Allied armies advanced into Lorraine. American troops occupied the installation briefly, then turned it over to French forces who found their old positions largely unchanged. The memorial plaque in Gallery 12 was still in place, though someone had scratched additional graffiti beside it. The fort returned to French military control and was maintained in operational condition for several years. In 1965, the French military decommissioned most Maginot Line fortifications as obsolete. Modern warfare had moved far beyond the strategic concepts that had driven their construction. Fort Hackenberg was preserved as a historical site and eventually opened to public tours. Thousands of visitors walked the galleries each year, learning about the fortification's design and its role in military history. Tour guides mentioned the construction deaths discovered after the war, but said nothing about voices or hauntings. Such stories were considered inappropriate for family-oriented historical tourism. The memorial plaque remained visible in Gallery 12. Most visitors passed it without noticing or caring. Occasionally, someone would ask about it, and tour guides would explain that it honored construction workers who had died during the building phase. They did not mention Margaret Keller specifically. Her story was too complicated, too poorly documented, too strange to include in the standard tour narrative. In 1998, a paranormal investigation team requested permission to spend a night in Fort Hackenberg, hoping to document evidence of haunting. The site administrators denied the request. The fort was a historical monument, not a venue for ghost hunting. The decision was final and not subject to appeal. The investigators complained to local media about closed-minded bureaucrats suppressing evidence of the supernatural, but no one paid much attention. The fort remained a historical site dedicated to education rather than sensation. Captain Arnoux's journal resurfaced in 2003 when a military historian researching Maginot Line operations discovered it in the archives. The historian was struck by the detailed accounts of the phenomena and the investigation. He contacted elderly veterans who might have served at Fort Hackenberg and found 3 who confirmed that strange events had occurred, though their memories were fragmentary after so many decades. The historian considered writing a book about the case, but eventually decided against it. The story was interesting, but too narrow in scope to support a full manuscript. He published a short article in a specialized journal instead, reaching an audience of perhaps 200 academics and military history enthusiasts. Margaret Keller's grave in the military cemetery remained undisturbed. The simple wooden cross had been replaced at some point with a more permanent marker, though it still bore no dates, only her name. The cemetery was not regularly visited, located in a rural area that few people had reason to travel through. The grave was maintained by cemetery staff, who kept the grass trimmed and the markers upright, but knew nothing about the woman buried there or the circumstances of her death and burial. In 2012, a genealogy enthusiast researching German families in Lorraine came across the name Margaret Keller in census records from the 1920s. The record showed a woman by that name living in a small village near the German border. She had been born in 1894, making her 40 years old in 1934. She was listed as unmarried, employed in domestic service. Census records ended in 1931, and no subsequent documentation could be found. The genealogist noted this as an interesting dead end, but could not pursue it further without additional sources. The connection to Fort Hackenberg and the construction worker who had died there was never made. The genealogist published family tree information online, including the fragmentary data about Margarete Keller. The information sat in a genealogy database, accessible to anyone who searched but noticed by no one. It remains there still, a small piece of a puzzle that no one is actively trying to solve. Fort Hackenberg continues to operate as a historical site. The galleries are well maintained, the lighting is modern and reliable, and tour groups move through in organized waves during summer months when tourism peaks. The concrete walls remain solid. The gun turrets still turn on their mechanisms. The electric trains that once transported ammunition now carry tourists. The place feels mundane, almost cheerful, with its informational placards and gift shop and cafe serving sandwiches and coffee. Occasionally, a visitor reports something odd. A voice heard in a distant tunnel, a figure glimpsed in peripheral vision, a sudden cold spot in a gallery where temperature should be constant. The tour guides smile and suggest that old buildings create unexpected sounds, that shadows can be deceptive, that ventilation systems sometimes produce localized temperature variations. They do not encourage speculation about hauntings. They maintain professional demeanor and redirect attention to historical facts. But sometimes, late at night when the tours have ended and the fort is empty except for maintenance staff, someone walking through Gallery 12 might pause near the memorial plaque. They might feel a presence, nothing threatening but unmistakably there. They might hear, very faintly, a woman's voice asking about water. And they might wonder what really happened in these tunnels during that year of voices. During that time when the dead seemed to speak to the living and the fort itself seemed to possess consciousness. The truth, if there is a single truth, remains elusive. Perhaps Margarete Keller's spirit did manifest in the place where she died, seeking acknowledgement and proper rest. Perhaps the fort's massive structure created acoustic and psychological conditions that produced hallucinations in isolated soldiers. Perhaps the combination of stress, isolation, and unconscious awareness of hidden graves created shared experiences that felt supernatural but were ultimately explicable through psychology and neurology. Perhaps all these explanations are partially correct, or perhaps none of them capture what actually occurred. The memorial plaque still hangs on the wall in Gallery 12, bronze weathered to dark patina, letters carved deep enough to remain legible. Margarete Keller's name persists there, visible to anyone who looks, though few do. She has her memorial, small and insufficient though it may be. She is remembered, at least by the wall itself, by the concrete that surrounds her name. And in the silence of the deep tunnels, when no one is present to hear, perhaps she still whispers, asking about water, seeking what she never found in life. The fort stands, the tunnels remain. The stories persist among those who know them. And in the space between documented history and unexplained experience, the whispers in the Maginot Line continue, heard or unheard, real or imagined, eternal as the concrete walls that contain them.